Okay, welcome everybody. So my name is Tracy Glenn, and I'm with the MB Media Co-op, one of the hosts for tonight. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the stolen lands of the Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, and Mi'kmaq peoples, and that as an event that is talking about the media, that it's really important that we acknowledge the territory, that we talk about colonial relations, which is something that the MB Media Co-op strives to do. We have also been recently covering the government of New Brunswick's move to stop land acknowledgements. So I encourage you to read Chief Ron Tremblay's statement on that you can find on the MB Media Co-op website, as well as other coverage of that. I'm excited to be able to introduce tonight's event. So the MB Media Co-op and Stu Journalism and Communications is co-hosting Julian Walker's book launch, Wires Cross, Memoir of a Citizen and Reporter, in the Irving Press. So tonight we have Jamie Gillies, one of Julian's colleagues. He's going to introduce Julian. So Jamie is the chair of the Student Journalism and Communications program, as well as the executive director of the Frank McKenna Center for Communications and Public Policy at St. Thomas University. So I'll hand it over to you, Jamie, to introduce our author tonight.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out to this event. First of all, I want to thank the NB Media Co-op for hosting this event and inviting the Department of Journalism and Communications here at St. Thomas to host alongside. Thank you so much. It is an honor to introduce Julian Walker tonight. As a colleague and a mentor, he was instrumental in helping to establish the journalism and communication programs at St. Thomas. And on a personal note, he has been so generous with his support, enthusiasm, and time. Julian, I think, is the definition of someone who has spent their career in life fighting the good fight. In journalism, in politics and government, in academia, he has done as much as anyone to fight for good values and fight for what's right. And as an academic, he holds 4 university degrees in journalism, politics, and French studies. As a professor, he inspired students, some of whom are with us tonight, to pursue careers in media and journalism, and encourage them always to strive for a better media and a better press. As a journalist and editor with the St. Croix Courier, he led a team that did hard-hitting investigative journalism in the local area and held the powers that be to the fire. And in government, beyond the sage counsel he provided for a new premier, he fought for environmental protection and enforcement as a deputy minister at a time when it was most needed. Tonight, Julian will speak about his new book and memoir, Wires Crossed, Memoir of a Citizen and Reporter in the Irving Press. And while many of us gathered here tonight have plenty of opinions about the state of journalism and media in this province, do keep in mind that Julian has been part of this conversation and battle for decades. And while some of the topics and questions may focus on the link between media and industry, perhaps we might consider in our discussion tonight what an independent and alternative media could and should look like in New Brunswick, and the new shapes that it might take. So without further ado, please welcome Julian Walker.
Well, thank you, Jamie. A very generous introduction. I think a little bit on the high side, I would say, but I appreciate it. Appreciate it very much. I want to thank as well the Media Co-op and Stu Journalism for co-hosting tonight, and say a thank you to all others who are participating on the call. As maybe some of you know, I've been living down a long road in the woods of Charlotte County for the whole of COVID, and really since I retired from the department. With that distance and perspective, I think deepened my stance about the Irving Press and the need for a much stronger free press in our province. I think many of you are familiar with my basic argument that we have an unhealthy situation here in New Brunswick, where almost all our newspapers and much of the large industry are owned by the same family members. Two spheres which should operate independently have what I call a wires crossed relationship. I argue that this very close tie between the two has profound consequences for our province, our politics, and our voice. In order to make the argument, I want to read two passages from my book, not because they represent the Holy Grail, heaven forbid, but because they represent the very best of what I could come up with from down that long road. I should tell you that I do feel tonight rather like Ferdinand the Bull, who was raised to enjoy bullfights, but preferred to skip the fighting and smell the flowers in the pasture. And I should say that the way climate change is unfolding in our country right now, there certainly aren't many flowers left. The country's had a terrible few days. Each of the two passages I wanted to write from my memoir requires some lead up and explanation. Firstly, Aaron Stoiter, a pioneering political scientist in this field, studied a long and bitter strike, another strike, at the Irving Oil Refinery in St. John. In 1999, she wrote her important description of the Irving media's coverage of the strike. She wrote, "The Irvings are reporting on themselves." I think Professor Stoiter sums up very well, in just a very few words, our media problem in New Brunswick. It's not very complicated. I argue that all began in the equal opportunity era of the 1960s. And forgive me if I'm a bit historical, but I think an awful lot of today arises from the equal opportunity era of the 60s. You recall that Premier Louis Robichaud and his reforming government clashed at that time with industrial giant Casey Irving. And incidentally, for those of you who are interested in social justice issues, which I know the MB Media Co-op has shown itself to be, I think the 60s are a very important and interesting decade to study. As I have somewhat of a Robin Hood view of the role of government, politics, and the press, I was certainly drawn to the equal opportunity story. Mr. Irving was absolutely opposed to a key part of equal opportunity. And we came to know it as EO, as you know. That was the Robichaud government's anticipated elimination of tax concessions for large industry, most of it owned by the Irving interests. Existing tax concessions were granted at the county level. We may forget that. For instance, reduced water rates for mills or lower property taxes. These made it attractive to locate heavy industry in certain counties like St. John. With a bigger tax base, stronger social services could be offered in the wealthier counties, especially in education, where the richest county, St. John, was spending $312 per year per student, whereas the poorest county, Gloucester County in the north, was spending just $144 per student, less than half as much. EO aimed to overcome such disparities to the benefit of the French counties and the poorer English ones, like my native Charlotte County. Meantime, the Irving Press, particularly the Friesen Gleaner, had burst strongly into the picture. In the late 1950s, Mr. Irving had quietly taken control of the Gleaner, a deal consummated, as I say, quietly by lawyers meeting in New York, but not confirmed for New Brunswickers until 1969, a full decade later, and completing the daily newspaper monopoly in the province, which declined a bit over time because one of the media studies that the federal government sponsored suggested that the Irvings drop out of a couple of their second dailies in two towns, Moncton and St. John, and the Irvings jumped ahead of the commission and did it on their own. Gleaner publisher Michael Wardell trained in the Fleet Street British press of Lord Beaverbrook, and he demonstrated the artful but quite ruthless strength of a campaigning media outlet. Wardell launched a no-holds-barred attack on EO on behalf of Mr. Irving. But once and only once, KC went to the legislature to argue his case. To give you the flavor of those times, I will read a first passage from my book with direct quotes from Hansard. But at first, I need to explain the 1963 event, which became known as the Who Governs New Brunswick election. Premier Robichaud thought the heavy mineral giant Noranda would be very good to develop one of the world's largest deposits of heavy metals in what became Brunswick mines. And Casey Irving had in mind a major share of that very rich resource, a major share for his empire. A new Miramichi pulp mill was also contemplated. Louis was discussing this with Mr. Robichaud was discussing this with Italian interests, and KC wanted the new mill and its rich timber limits for his empire. But Premier Robichaud wanted to diversify control of the natural resources of the province and didn't want to oblige KC on either account, the Brunswick mines or the new pulp mill. The two went head to head, but in a move I think you'd call extraordinary political courage, Louis Robichaud stuck his foot in the door and called the 63 election, which indeed was an election about who runs New Brunswick. The Liberal government picked up one seat in that election. It wasn't the landslide that Premier Robichaud hoped to achieve, but it was a win. And KC left the battlefield very unhappy. So now I'll go on and read about when Casey Irving went to the legislature to argue his case. And I think it's quite meaningful to tell how the Irving family and the Irving Empire sold their wares over the next 60 years or so. The program, Equal Opportunity, this time with legislation, was introduced in the House in November 1965, a further delay after the White Paper. 30 days later, Casey Irving made his bitter, personal, and highly unusual appearance before the Law Amendments Committee. Casey was an angry man on that gray and snowy December day. As he prepared to inject himself into the feisty environment of the small but beautiful New Brunswick legislature, Casey was still hurting from the defeat of his ambitions for his industrial and natural resources empire, and wary of the radical reforms being advanced by the premier. So Casey got his chance at the legislature. And the statement he made on behalf of his giants, Irving Refining Limited, J.D. Irving Limited, and Irving Pulp and Paper Limited, would become a business and street politics argument of the Irving family over the next half century. The family patriarch cited the realities of a poor province constantly seeking jobs for its people, a real sense of patriotism. He said that the Irving refinery in St. John would have been better off over the previous 4 years if he had shut it down and the Irvings had imported fully refined petroleum from abroad. Irving thundered, "We did not build the refinery to shut it down. We built it as part of an industrial expansion to create jobs for New Brunswickers. And we built it after we had negotiated tax agreements in good faith." Irving said he did not debunk the wider government objective of equal opportunity for all, and stated, "No one disagrees with this high principle." But speaking without apology, right across the table to the Liberal ministers and MLAs facing him, Irving said, "No sane person is going to agree with the method proposed to achieve this principle. You cannot get blood out of a stone." So there's the man. He was forceful. You might find a little bit of a parallel with Jim Irving going before the committee the other day to defend the use of glyphosate. Both men had a tremendous command. They spoke with authority and they acted with authority. From their KC speaking at the ledge, the Gleaner picked up the fight when a key Liberal minister blinked before Casey's onslaught and said that the government would no longer eliminate existing tax concessions, but would only outlaw new ones. The Banner Gleaner headline read, "Government backs down, Irving's blast at Assessment Act proves effective." In fact, while there was a certain give by the government, the method of collection of tax changed as a result of equal opportunity, so that all assessments were done provincially, not by county. And some of the bargaining for attracting industry was removed because of that. But it wasn't in that exchange in the House that the marriage of Irving Media and Irving Industry was cemented. All the weapons were used. Divisive slogans about French and English in the province as a whole, caustic editorial cartoons, church sermons quoted in the Gleaner that spoke of innuendo about corruption in government. And New Brunswickers came to understand more and more through the Irving Press that the Irvings were the source of employment and economic stability in the province. Just like those recent billboards along the province's highways stating that Irving is hiring. The year 2000 was a pivotal year in the increasing control by the Irving Press. After that year, Brunswick News bought up virtually all the remaining weekly papers. There were interested sellers out there and one major interested buyer. The combination of English daily newspaper monopoly and ever tighter grip on the community press as well led a key member of the 2006 Canadian Senate Committee on the News Media to state, We didn't find anywhere else in the developed world a situation like the situation in New Brunswick. And I'm not sure if Mark Tunney could be on the call tonight, but he was the one who got that quote in his thesis, MA thesis, which was a good one. I do not claim that the result of this situation with the Irving Press, that Irving family members picked up the phone every day to tell their reporters to cover this story or bury this one beneath the obituaries in the paper. Yet many reporters in the Irving Press work in an environment where there are unwritten rules. And I must be blunt here. It's tough to bite the hand that feeds you. I know this because I was once an Irving newspaper reporter and columnist myself. When this became too uncomfortable, I decided to move on. I went first to the Ottawa Journal, a daily paper, and in a very competitive Ottawa market with the Ottawa Citizen. And while I enjoyed that there, I had the chance to come back to my hometown paper, which was the St. Croix Courier in St. Stephen, NB. That paper had few resources, but gave us a lot of freedom to do the stories that were important to let be ignored. I do not argue that there are no good pieces of journalism in the Irving Press, but there are obvious gaps, especially ones about Irving industry, where topics tend to be covered in a light way with little or no investigative work done. I asked again, and I said this on the radio the other day, when was the last time you read a full investigative story on the use of defoliants in the province's forest industry, the health and environmental consequences, as well as the economic interests of the forest companies? People sometimes think that investigative journalism puts out a whole alternate side of a story. But I tend to believe that good journalism is balanced. If it is well done, it will encourage discussion, inform debate, and change. And it will also get closer to the truth because of the facts that are unearthed. And I'll come back to that. One example of a story from the St. Croix Courier was to do with the Latang Estuary, or Lake Utopia paper, you might know it as. The citizens of the area spoke through our Courier pages about their concerns about the poisonous gas, hydrogen sulfide. As a small paper, we really struggled to get the story out. But then we wrote an entire issue of the paper about it. That prompted J.K. Irving, the oldest son of KC, to put his engineers to work on the problem. And say what you will, the Irvings, when they move, they know how to get things done. They don't, funnily enough, like to have a poor reputation. They did not cause that particular problem. That was done by a previous owner of that mill. Wood fiber sitting and rotting in the presence of salt water and causing the creation of hydrogen sulfide gas, which you may know as the smell of rotten eggs, but it is highly poisonous and causes the flooding of the lungs if you have too much of it. The Irvings did not cause that particular problem, and they didn't want to be blamed for it. But I'll give you another example, and this one not so positive. This is the famous and ill-fated proposal to sell our power utility, NB Power, to Hydro-Quebec, resulting in a proposed 30% cut in power rates to Irving and other large industries. And it gave a power rate freeze to residential customers, which kind of ticked them off, with Irving getting 30% production, and they were on a freeze. The very next day after the draft agreement was announced, the Telegraph Journal declared this unstudied proposal the deal of the century. Think of that. In this, the Telegraph failed in its duty to rigorously examine the pros and cons of this seemingly astounding proposal. The draft deal was poorly thought out. The general public didn't like it. In something of a coming of age for our province, public opposition finally went out and kicked the idea out of town. In the conclusion of my book, I start by quoting a great American reporter, Robert Caro, as follows. And I'll go to, if you have the book with you, page 151. And Robert Caro is really an amazing reporter. He's written an incredible series of volumes about Lyndon Johnson, one of the most devious manipulators of the legislative process in the States, but also an extremely effective operator. So on page 151, I'm quoting Robert Caro. There is no one truth, no objective truth, no single truth, but there are facts, hard facts, objective facts, verifiable facts. And the more facts you come up with, the closer you come to whatever truth there is. I felt in my book that this is an excellent description of the nature and purpose of good journalism. Such a noble path for a free press does not now exist in New Brunswick. This book argues that the wires-crossed relationship in New Brunswick between a media monopoly and a strong industrial sector with the same family ownership has left the Irving Press in a mess. The Irving Press does not work in a risk-taking, courageous, and dynamic environment. Reporting the news should mean uncovering something new, an independent expression of what is happening in the community, putting forth opinions that stimulate discussion and change, getting us closer to the youth, to the truth. It is time for the Irvings to make, and this is I guess my punchline, but it is time for the Irvings to make an orderly withdrawal from the daily and community newspaper business. Irving Oil, lumber, or ships can compete on their own, as McCain French fries, Ganong chocolates, or Moosehead beer managed to do. None of these businesses need to operate their own press to thrive. Okay, and there's just one last part of that, perhaps a little more encouraging. On page 154, several citizens quoted in this book point to digital options for the free press. A shining example is the no newsprint Florida newspaper, the Tampa Bay Times, dripping with its Pulitzer prizes. And by the way, even the Tampa Bay Times has recently reported some financial difficulties and has been looking for donations. I think I will send them one. All that, though, down in Florida seems big and far away. However, close to home, an all-digital paper, the Halifax Examiner, has recently been showing the way with a small, talented, and dedicated staff, demonstrating what it is like to do feisty, in-depth journalism. This is what the tireless pursuit of the truth looks like. As we discovered on the St. Croix Courier, reporters do not command huge salaries, but there is no excitement for journalists quite like breaking news or standing up for what they believe and shouting it from the rooftops, criticism, be damned. So that's where I've got to. I hope we can get some good discussion going, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. That's fantastic. My name is Matthew Hayes. I'm with the NB Media Co-op, and I'm going to be facilitating the questions and answers. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is the little chat function, that little bubble, and you can open that and put questions in the chat on the right. You can type them in. We can either voice them for you, or we'll go to you if you would like to voice them yourself. And the floor is open. Julian, I really enjoyed your talk, and obviously there's so much in the topic. The Irving's kind of coming in and taking control of the Gleaner and opposing equal opportunities. I think it was in 1972 that Irving, KC Irving, left for Bermuda and offshored his fortune. That was something, though, that wasn't covered at the time. Can you tell us a little bit about how that was covered and how New Brunswickers came to learn about it?
Well, I have to say I chickened out a little bit in the book. I didn't go into that in great detail, but I think there was quite a sense of loss in the province that Irving had abandoned us, sort of. But, you know, my brother Giles, who's no longer living, but he was a good filmmaker, and he wrote a film called I Like to See Wheels Turn. But he did what they call a streeter, right, in journalism or filmmaking, where you ask people, you know, what do you think of that old guy Casey Irving, whatever. And so many of the people he interviewed said, geez, you know, wish we had 10 more like him. You know, Irving was extremely popular. He's, you know, the name is an iconic name. And so I do think there was a great sense of loss, and some folks like us felt it was a bit of a betrayal. But by and large, people quoted arguments such as, well, it's a private company, you know, they don't have stockholders and that type of stuff. They own everything privately. They face the world alone. No one's backing them up. So I'm not sure that's a complete answer to your question, but there was almost a mourning in the province at that time. And it's hard to believe, but the feeling of so many people was, we lost a great man.
Okay. Julian, I've got a question from Aditya Rao. Aditya, I'll go to you.
Yeah.
Hi, Julian. Thanks so much for this incredible presentation and talk. I'm so pleased to have been able to listen to you speak. And after having I'm new to the province. I've only been here a year and a few months now, and to me it's pretty clear that there's a media concentration problem. And I was surprised when I tried to learn a little bit about it, that this has been a conversation going on for something like 40 years, and it's been an issue this entire time, going back to the Kent Commission report and so on in the early 80s, late 70s, and I'm in trying to get involved here. I've had the privilege to join the board of the New Brunswick Media NB Media Co-op, and as a governance board member, and also get involved in the production of a TV show that we're doing in collaboration with CHCO TV, actually down in your neck of the woods right now, called the NB Debrief, where we're trying a little bit to redefine the landscape, media landscape a bit, and journalism as well, to be honest. But the question I've been sort of mulling over as I hear you give this speech, Julian, is, there was somebody told me the story about someone saying that, even a monkey can run the Irving business with the amount of government help they're getting, and the monopolies they now enjoy. and the extent to which they own everything and the industry and all of the newspapers and so on. I can't help but wonder if you think that when push comes to shove, whether the root of the problem is just the Irvings, whether the root of the problem is that particular family's control over everything in this province. And I was wondering if you could address that directly.
Okay, well, that's a good, I think there's an opinion behind your question. I think that's a very reasonable opinion to have or question to ask. I set out to try and address one Irving problem. I'm just a little guy, you know, been around a long time, and probably in the latter part of my career, I didn't figure I could take on the whole Irving empire in every aspect. I have always had a problem with this media part of it, and I decided to focus on that like a laser beam. And you know, I have had some respect for certain members of the Irving family, particularly J.K. Irving, who, you know, I was up against when I was Deputy Minister of the Environment. And he was very opposed to us starting to charge the Irving corporations. And we did. We hired a few former cops, and they didn't know what hit them at first. And Mr. Irving came in to talk to us, and he wasn't pleased. You know, he's one of the richest men in Canada. This is the guy who's in his 90s now, who I spent many enjoyable chats with. But he listened to us, and he said, well, you know, we got to do the right thing. And this extraordinary man was quite an environmentalist, and he didn't want to be tagged, like I said about the Latang estuary. He didn't want to shoulder the blame for that for his late days, you know. So I guess to go back to me taking on all Irving problems, I had this lingering respect for people like him, but also, you know, I just didn't feel I could take on the whole Irving problem. There is a much bigger Irving problem, I agree, than I've tackled, but that's for your generation now. You know, I think I do think you can only fight off so much, and so all power to you. But also, I think, you know, as you folks at the MB Co-op do your journalism, I think you have to keep the human quotient in there. You know, because we disagree with the Irvings in many respects, they are pretty solid human beings. You know, they donate a hell of a lot of money to different causes, and you know, you could say that's just for a tax dodge or something, but they're not evil people. They just like to control a lot of the world they touch, and that's a lot what the Irving Press is about. It doesn't necessarily make a hell of a lot of money. They like to control what's going on and how much their firms are being criticized or not criticized, you know, and so it's a bit of a mixed bag, mixed answer, but all power to you if you can carry on.
Okay. Well, we'll go to the next question, Julian. You know, just bearing in mind also that a lot of that charity, as Addie pointed out, is from tax advantages that they've received. You know, it's I'm not saying that they're not nice people, but they also need to be challenged, I think, by media. Russ Hunt on this point is saying, I've been hearing for a half century that if the Irvings weren't there, there'd be much less or much worse media in New Brunswick. That the province population is just too small to support even the inadequate press we have. What should I have been saying all these years, Julian? That's Russ's question. I was just going to add that, I mean, one of your punchlines was to divest, that Irvings should divest from the papers. What would that mean for the future of local reporting?
Okay, well, let me first talk to Russ's point, because he wrote the seminal book on the Irvings in New Brunswick, a wonderful book. And I remember one phrase in that book very clearly when the Telegraph Journal called Casey Irving the voice of New Brunswick. That's a scary thought to me, that they should be the voice of New Brunswick. You know, that's one of the reasons why I said at the start that this ugly situation hurts our province, our politics, and our voice, because it really does trim our voice to a very great extent. And we don't. Here's an example that Russ might not like to hear, but so many families depend on the Irvings for their kids to get summer employment planting trees, you know, and no one is willing to criticize the Irvings because, you know, of that tree planting or chance for a summer job or chance for a permanent job. So that is part of the blanket control of the Irvings. Russ so well expressed the problem of the voice of New Brunswick, and that very much stuck with me. And I think Russ is right in that. You know, there was a little paper on PEI at one time called the Broad Axe, and their motto was "Hew to the line, let the chips fall where they may." And I think, you know, people like Russ and Eddie, if I'm pronouncing your name right, or Tracy, your generation of folks have to pick up the fight. And I think it has to be a new type of journalism, a new type of investigative journalism that has a little more balance in it, that maybe Russ might like as well.
Before I go to Constantine, Russ, do you want to say anything else about that?
Well, except saying thank you, Julian. It seems to me that the question really is, if the Irving Empire did not support those newspapers, and you said they don't make a pile of money out of them, is it the case that New Brunswick would have a press that would be better? I've never really known really clearly how the economics of that might work out. I'm not suggesting that we wouldn't want to get rid of them, but I think, as Matthew says, if they left now, what would be the consequences? And you have more sense of that than I do, I think.
Well, I did use the term an orderly withdrawal, and you know, I have suggested in my book a strong role for the federal government to put a fund in place to support a new daily newspaper in the province, much like L'Acadie Nouvelle. That was put in place because of a small market for the Acadians of New Brunswick. And let's face it, English New Brunswick is a tiny market, and we can't really support on our own a new quality daily newspaper, or maybe a maritime newspaper. And it could be digital and all of that, but that doesn't get the revenue in necessarily, does it? You know, digital still struggles sometimes to compete against Facebook and Google for revenue. And I suppose another possibility that I would add to it is that while Philip Lee has put in place an incredible journalism education program for the province, but I think now we need to add something to that, which is entrepreneurial education in the media. There are lots of small types of media popping up in the United States. They're totally digital, and they're sort of like a newsroom in the air. And you don't necessarily need a huge infrastructure to run one of those. So I think there is hope. Still, there's various aspects of a solution, but I do commend you for your wonderful book, because it's right on my shelf. Let me find it here. There it is. Can you see that, Russ?
I think you can. I certainly can. I've
Get
been
the cover off it because it was read so many times. But
that is actually a really excellent book, and a lot of people mention it. The excellent work that Russ did. Constantine, I think you've got a question that flows really nicely with this topic.
Thank you, Matt. And Julian, it's a pleasure to see you. Thank you for your presentation. And if there is one good thing about COVID, it's the one that focused your mind and gave you the time to write this book, which has been inside you for a very long time. I know that from personally interacting with you. So thank you for that book, Julian. I want to look to the future, and you've alluded to it in your presentation and just a couple of minutes ago. I believe the print media is on its deathbed and is on life support. The future is digital. How do we get that digital opportunity that has a low upfront cost and investment to create the cacophony of voices and the plethora of ideas to contribute to a sound democratic discussion about the issues that are facing us in a way that everybody feels that they can listen to their point of view, which clearly from what you're telling us is not the case right now. Do you have any ideas about that, Julian?
well, I did mention the Halifax Examiner. I think they're a good example. They, for instance, did investigative story nailing the Irvings executives for their absolutely huge employer, the shipbuilding operation there in Halifax. Some of their executives went down in the States under COVID, and when they came back, they didn't self-isolate or anything. The Examiner exposed that. And there can be more examiners. You know, I don't think we're quite entrepreneurial enough. You're an economist, but you know the value of entrepreneurship, and we need more of our journalistic experts to have an entrepreneurial bent too. The desire to found a small paper and stir up some SHIT. You know, and the Courier, was an experience that wasn't just about exposing corruption at Point Lepreau, say. It was also covering the damn council a lot better. We really covered council. You know, that's a good part of journalism too. And you don't need a huge investigative budget to do that. You just have to be at every meeting and get to know the personalities and expose the little personal corruption that does exist at the local level sometimes. There's just so much out there to do. And I hope a lot of our young people have that bent to create something as well as do good journalism. Create a small newspaper of the air. I don't even like to use the word newspaper anymore because everybody thinks of newsprint, but newspapers can be digital, you know, and they can eliminate an awful lot of costs that way. But I still think we need a federal government to support all that entrepreneurship education, to have combines, investigation capability, to outlaw so much concentration of ownership in the media, not just in Canada, but obviously in New Brunswick. We need something like a trust fund to back up our more high quality media. There's no magic wand, obviously, but I think a lot of the graduates who are turning out of STU journalism have fire in their belly. You know, I know they want to do the journalism, but what we may not have enough of is the ones that are rather like the Eastern Graphic, Jim McNeil types in PEI. He called his newspaper the Lively One. And no, he was a hell of a good entrepreneur. He founded 2 papers, and the civil servants in PEI lived in fear of what Jim McNeil would write about them the next week. And you know, so we need some education in that realm as well, and people who aren't ashamed really of making a buck. You know, revenue in journalism, or at least in small newspapers, call them that, tends to flow where there is circulation. And circulation flows where you have a product that it's worth reading. I don't think we have much revenue flowing to the Irving papers because there's so many people say there's nothing in it. But if you have a rising circulation, you have something that people need to read or digest in radio, if it's radio, and that is a saleable item. I wouldn't like to see the entire journalism field go to the CBC, much as I like the CBC. And one of the best things that ever happened to New Brunswick was we got our own independent CBC television network. But I don't think we should all be working for the CBC. You know, I like the idea of little independents trying to make a buck. There's no harm in that.
All right, we got a question from Nicole, and there are a few others as well.
Yeah, hi, this is great. I mean, Julian, I talked to you about this project like 3 or 4 years ago, and when I got to campus, because I'm still working at home a lot, and I got your book in a package. It was so thrilling. It was so thrilling to see the result. So I applaud you for your productivity and sticking to this, because we really need these stories to be told. With respect to circulation.
Well, just as if I may, I applaud you for running, you know.
Oh, well, well, on that note,
public life.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. But on that note, I'll just make a quick comment about, we tried to figure out if it'd be worth our while to put ads in the Gleaner. And we ended up putting some in the Gleaner, but most of the Green Party membership had made it very clear that they did not subscribe to the Gleaner because of all the reasons that we've been discussing this evening. But anyway, that's beside the point. My question has to do with political culture in New Brunswick. A lot of us are outsiders to this province. And when I showed up here in 2009, I had just been at a book signing where Alan Blakeney, former Premier of Saskatchewan, had written a book on politics and administration of government. And I said, I've got a job in New Brunswick. And he says, oh, it's a company province. And I didn't quite understand like the extent of that, but he was right, of course. I think the crowd in front of me tonight understands what that means. So when I got here, I thought, well, I'll just start doing some research and write a paper. How hard can that be? So I ended up writing a paper with my brother about Medicare in New Brunswick, and we studied Robichaud and whatnot. But of course, you ran into the Irvings because we ran into equal opportunity. And one of the interviews I did was with Fred Drummy, who passed away a couple of years ago, but he was one of the architects of equal opportunity. And I went down to St. Stephen to interview him. And he said, I hope you brought your toothbrush because we're going to have so much to talk about. You're going to have to stay overnight. We're going to need 2 days for this. So luckily I had brought my toothbrush, and we talked for hours and hours and hours and hours. And what Fred told me was that the Legislative Amendments Committee was set up as a way to smoke out the Irvings, because what had happened before the 1960s is that anything that Casey didn't like, he would just stomp into the Premier's office and say, well, you better change your mind because we don't like it. So they thought, well, we need some kind of transparency and accountability mechanism. So they set up the Legislative Amendments Committee so that if anybody had a problem, whether it be Casey Irving or your neighbor down the street with a proposed piece of legislation, they'd have to stand in line, go on the public record. There would be transcripts, which are now available in the archives. And I want your opinion on to what extent did that actually work? And what has gone sideways since? And has the media conglomeration in this province been kind of a response to that transparency and accountability mechanisms that Robichaud and friends put in place? You see the media concentration evolving right after that, right? So there's that real tussle between the transparency and accountability, leave it to the people, we're doing things in their benefit, to the, no, we don't want to tell anybody anything. We're a private company, we're a family, and through our benevolent dictatorship methods, we actually know better, right? That's the essential fight in this province. So I guess with that, I'll just ask your opinion on some of that ebb and flow that was going on in such an exciting time period in this province.
Well, I talked to Fred quite a bit myself. I'll tell you one little story that he gave me is that they were desperate to overcome the influence of the Daily Gleaner as a government. The Gleaner was all over them, tearing them apart. You know, the ministers in the churches were preaching against the government and all of this. And he said what they decided to do, and some of the backbenchers in the government initiated this, I think. Not just Louis was having his trouble, you know, he was exhausted by then. And they said, well, we'll just go out in the countryside and we'll talk to people in their church basements, you know, the little halls, and we'll sell equal opportunity that way. And they succeeded in that. You know, 5 years after KC went to this famous Law Amendments Committee that you speak of, Louis was still in power. You know, at one point, Michael Wardell, the damnable Michael Wardell, had predicted in 1965 that people had to fight to the death because the government was going to break apart and should get ready to grab the reins of power, more or less, and so on. And he was spectacularly wrong. Like the government lived on not only through an election that Michael Wardell called for the coming year, but 5 more years. And the government made these, I'm rambling here, but the government made a lot of concessions, as I say, in order to get the thing through. But when it came a couple years on, the Assessment Act had been passed, the New Municipalities Act had been passed, all the assessments were done in Fredericton. There was no more county assessing anymore. And it was something of a miracle what they had pulled off. And anyway, don't give up hope. There's fun in public life yet. Well, the title of my column that I wrote for a few years was An Honorable Calling. And that was a reference to journalism, yes, but also to politics. I never met a whole bunch of corrupt politicians when I worked in politics. They were very hardworking people who were exhausted trying to serve their constituents, and some of them got in trouble. But it was an important role in our society. So I hope you run again.
Julian, I've got a question also from Margot Shepard. She's wondering, actually, I think the question really is about whether there are other mechanisms also in New Brunswick, in addition to journalism, for holding the Irvings accountable. She's asking about maybe a royal commission or a Combines investigation into corruption or anything like that. What role might something like that play?
Well, I say the federal government has to do a lot more, but another commission, I don't know. We've had 3 big ones and they gathered a lot of dust along the way. But I think we need a lot of leadership from the federal government. I'd like to see Dominic LeBlanc do a lot more. He's very close to the Irvings, but his father was a great journalist. Romeo LeBlanc became Governor General, was a great Minister of Fisheries. And sometimes quality leadership can be as important as another royal commission or whatever. If someone could prick the conscience of Dominic LeBlanc, he's got all the power he would ever need to fix a lot of these problems. I don't think he's read my book lately. Margot, can you hear me? She's maybe on audio, is she?
She may not be able to get, oh, there she is, yeah. She hears you.
Yeah, okay. Well, there are leaders at the municipal level too, Margot, that can do a lot. And when Matthew gets elected, something or other.
I'm glad that Margot is there doing some of that work. She's doing a fantastic job. There are a couple of other notes in the chat. Many of them are congratulatory, Julian. So if you haven't had a look at the chat, you may want to. Linnea, I don't know whether you've got a question there, or if it's a comment, or whether you want to voice it.
It's not really a question. I can voice it.
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I actually was a co-op student at Brunswick News when I was in high school. So I'm going to get your book for sure because I'm super interested in it. I know that the Brunswick News has cut a lot of employees. It doesn't look like what it did in the 90s. People that used to work the printing presses, they are long gone. And I believe they've cut some journalists and photographers, and they've even moved the Telegraph Journal basically right next to the Irving oil operations where the oil by rail and tanker terminal are located. So I'm concerned about how this will affect quality journalism in the province. I guess I do kind of have a question. Is there any way to bring back the media monopoly back to a Senate committee to be looked at again? I feel like it's time that it gets revisited.
Okay. Julian, you want to take that on?
Well, I remember when the Carleton Free Press was operating, and it didn't operate for long, but one of our politicians who became premier ultimately, but he was very, very disappointed that the Irvings effectively put that paper out of business. And he asked for the Senate committee of the day, which was the committee I quoted, and which said New Brunswick was worse than any other jurisdiction in the developed world for this type of cross-media ownership. He asked for them to come back and study this case of the Irvings really appearing to have, for Brunswick News, to put that little paper out of business. And that committee never came back. I don't know if it would be easy to start another one to look at this project. I like your ethic and I like your energy in proposing it, but somehow I do think we need to put a fire under some of our politicians, some of our leaders, to come out. You know, I haven't heard any politician lately come out and say, we've got a bad thing going here with our media. Does anybody know of someone who said that?
Well,
they rely on the press to get elected, right?
there are several of us who are really confused about how much access certain industry groups have to the Irving media pages. You know, as speaking as someone who's been involved also with advocating for the rights of tenants in New Brunswick, there have been an awful lot of op-eds about the so-called double tax for landlords of late. So it seems as though we could use some additional voices out there for sure, no?
Right. Well, as I told you, I'm not very knowledgeable about that issue, but I can see that it would infuriate you.
I think it would infuriate.
You know, that they're because it's such a shouting need for care for tenants in New Brunswick right now. And so the landlords are getting together and crying poor.
Yeah. Russ Hunt has a comment in here. Russ, do you want to voice it? It's about the digital presence of the Irving Press, or the lack of digital presence.
Yeah, well, I hadn't intended to pose it as a question exactly. It's more a reflection. But it struck me that the Irving Press, more than any newspaper newspapers I'm aware of, has managed to make it impossible to find their copy through libraries. I mean, normally my experience used to be that a newspaper would publish the stuff, and maybe there'd be an embargo or something, but at some point you could get their, if they were the newspaper of record, for example, you could find out things online. And the Irving Press is absolutely inaccessible online, as far as I'm aware, even through the university library. I don't know what that means about them, and I really don't know, maybe others who know more about the current state of journalism have more sense of how common that is. But I've been quite surprised by it.
I share your surprise, Russ. And Julian, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, they have one of the worst digital access in journalism anywhere, I think. You know, they do obituaries fairly well, but that's about it. Yeah. But how do we persuade them on that one more than any others? Russ, I sent you my book, but it got returned to me.
Just looking at the
I sent
chat.
it to the university.
I certainly didn't return it, Julian. I haven't been in a bookstore a long time, but I'm going there pretty soon now. I'll pick one up. I'll pay for it.
Okay, but I did send you one to the office, but you're beyond the office now. You're in the elite.
I'm just looking at the chat to see if there are any other questions or comments, and I don't think I'm seeing any. Julian, I guess I want to thank you for starters. You know, this was a really fascinating talk. There's a lot of really interesting history of journalism in New Brunswick that we can learn from and build on. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to sitting down with the book. You can get the book, I think, a little bit all over town. I saw some copies in the Westminster bookstore here in Fredericton the other day.